Okay, good morning guys. I was running a few minutes late. Let's go ahead and get started. One quick note, a couple people have had issues with embedding the Google map on their website. If you're having problems with that, the trick is to pull up a location in your map, and it's a little bit annoying because Google Maps, like the actual Maps URL, won't let you embed it in an iframe for that security reason that we had talked about a little bit. So if you find a location, say let's just do like St. Louis, you can get an iframe embeddable link. They actually give you the full iframe that you use. You go here and you can go share, and then you can go to embed map, and then it gives you the actual iframe link. You can choose which size you want to. I think that size just affects the this actual width and height here, which obviously we can change ourselves. But you notice the link's a little bit different. Like up here, it's google.com/map/place whatever. Here it's actually google.com/map/embed. So only that URL does Google allow you to embed in an iframe for kind of security reasons. So anyway, that's why you're running into that. So that's how you make that work. So, okay, let's kind of keep looking at our CSS rules. So we're going to talk about styling our lists, our tables, and our forms today. So by default, as we've seen in our website so far, tables, lists, and forms are styled very sparsely, right? So they have really minimal styling by default. So like lists, each list item gets a new line. That's minimal styling. Forms get a little bit of styling. It's obvious where an input is because it has a border around it. Those kinds of things are really basic styles that the browser provides by default. So it's important to add some, style through our CSS to these elements to help them fit in the theme of your website. It's also important to note that browsers will display these things slightly different. Styles will kind of help you achieve some consistency across browsers. So one thing you'll notice is that different browsers will treat them slightly different. Forms especially will look a little bit different in each browser. Some browsers will do like rounded corners around the form inputs. Some browsers do square corners. It just kind of depends. So if we add our own styles on top of that, we can kind of override those defaults a little bit and provide some consistency. So the first thing we'll look at is list style. So by default, if you do an unordered list, you get bullet points, right? There are a couple of other options that we can do. So the list style type property allows you to control the shape and style of a bullet point on a list. You can apply it to ordered list items. If you have an ordered list but you don't necessarily want it to be numbered, you could use list style type to set it to something else. Otherwise, you can add it to your UL overall or your LI element. They can use the following values. So you can do none. So that's important. Sometimes we don't want bullet points. Most of my lists I use on websites, I use none because I either want to do my own styling to indicate that it's a list, or I just don't want bullet points. So none is really useful. Disk is the default. So you may find instances where it's something else is happening and you want to set it back to disk, or there's circle and square as two alternative options. You might do that. By default, I think maybe one of the browsers will style sub-lists differently. So if you have like a UL inside of another UL, it might change the list style type, to like squares or something for a sub-list. But by default, most browsers won't do that for you. So you may say like UL space UL list style type is square, indicating, a unordered list inside of another unordered list, which would mean you're dealing with like a sub-list or sub-bullet points. That way you can differentiate them a little bit by having a little bit different style list. Ordered lists also use the list style type property, but you have some different values that can be used to indicate what type of numbering your ordered list should use. So you have decimal, which is the default, so it's just going to be 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. You can do decimal dash leading dash 0, which will number them 0, 1, 0, 2, so on and so forth. You can also do alpha, so you can have it be ABC or uppercase ABC. Or you could do I, V, so on and so forth, if you wanted Roman numerals. So again, there's just options, ways to kind of control the way that our lists appear. Another option is to specify an image to act as the bullet point. So sometimes we want not just a boring, plain circle, but we want to use some sort of image to add a little bit more style. So maybe an image of an arrow or some sort of icon that you want to use. So you can use the list style image property to do that, and then the values uses the formatted URL, and then with the URL to your image inside of there. Again, it can be absolute or relative. It could be a file you have on your site, or it could be an external file on some other site. You might need to add some margin and padding to space the text of the list properly, depending on the size of the image used. So, if you set list style image, to an image that's 200 pixels by 200 pixels, that's going to be pretty big. It's going to start to overlap with your text by default. So you might need to add like some margin left to your list items to push the text over a little bit, something along those lines. So here's an example. So we might say UL, and then our rule is list style type, and then URL images / star.png to have some sort of star be our list item. So that's really useful. Another style that can be useful is the list style position. So lists are indented into the page by default. So usually when you have a list, you see some margin applied to it. It's kind of indented a little bit. But you can indicate whether the marker should appear inside or outside the box containing the list. I'll show some examples of this in a little bit. It'll kind of help make sense. But if you set the outside value, it'll cause the bullet point to sit to the left of the block of text. And that's the default behavior. So you've got your text like this. So, you've got your bullet point, and then you've got your text. And then any overlapping text will just be here because this is outside. So this is your block of text, and this is where the bullet point is. So that's the outside property. If you set it to inside, it'll cause the marker to sit inside the box of text, and just the text itself will be indented. So you'll have, a bullet point, you'll have your text, but then it's inside the box of text, so your text will kind of flow to the left a little bit more. So your box of text is like this, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a subtle difference, but it can come into play, especially if you use like an image or something. You might want it to sit outside of all of your text and have it all be indented. Questions there? I think maybe I have an example. Yeah, so this is again what the outside looks like. Here's your box of text and the marker is outside, whereas inside your box of text and then the marker's inside, so it'll kind of wrap onto the same line. So it's a subtle difference, but I run into this a lot if you're doing some sort of a UI and you want like to use a list and have like a control or something. You would want it to sit outside of your text. So. Okay, you can also do list style as kind of a shorthand attribute to set both the list style and the list position in one property. So you give the position value first, followed by a space, and then the style or the image. So you can do list style, and then you can say like inside and circle to set both the position, which is inside, and the style, in this case circle. Or you can use an image. So you can say list style inside, and then provide an image in place of the style. So again, it's just kind of a way to do both of those things in one rule. Questions so far about lists? Okay. A couple other styles just to talk about that are useful for lists. Sometimes you might want to change the background of lists, the background color a little bit, or maybe have them alternate, so every other row has a little bit different background color, alternating between dark and light or something to help kind of separate each item in the list. Sometimes you want to give a border around your list items, or even just a border bottom. Sometimes I'll do that. I'll say, on my list item, give a border bottom of 1 pixel solid, whatever. That just kind of creates a line in between each of your list items. That can be useful. So there's different ways that we would style them using kind of the text styling or the box styling as well. These are just the rules that are really specific to lists. Okay, let's talk about tables. So tables by default have very little styling, as you've noticed if you've used them yet, and they're not very easy to read. If you have a table with some data in it, everything's really compressed. It can be really confusing where one cell starts and where one ends. It's not very easy to read, but we can use some CSS properties to add some basic style and spacing to our tables, which makes them more useful. So good things to do. These are just kind of general styles that we've learned already. You could use width to set the width of your table, which sounds really obvious, but you'll notice by default your width or your table will only take up the width necessary to show your data and without a lot of spacing. So by setting the width of our table to a certain width, it'll kind of help space things out a little bit by default. It'll give it a little bit room to breathe. And then it'll kind of, fill in the gaps, and it'll take up however much space it needs to for certain, columns. But it's usually important to set the width to something so it won't just compress into small spaces that possibly could. You can also use padding to set space between the border of each table cell and its content. That's really important. Otherwise, especially if you have, a border in your table, you'll have column 1, column 2, column 3, and it's just really tight. So by setting some padding, we can have it be, more like this, where it's, spaced out a little bit. It's nicer, easier to read. It's not as condensed. I also like to use text transform to do things like convert the content of the table headers to uppercase or something along those lines to help indicate that they're headers. You can also use font weight to set the headers to bold, something along those lines, just to kind of make clear that it's a header and it's distinct from the rest of your data. A couple of other styles that are good to use. You can add some additional styling to the content of your table headers or your rows. So, letter spacing to kind of space out the headers a little bit. Any way that you can make the headers stand out as distinct from the actual data is really useful. So you might make them a little bit bigger font size. I actually would disagree with that now. I don't think I'd like to make the font size bigger necessarily in the headings, but make them bold, make them, add letter spacing, something along those lines. You can also add borders above or below the table heading or the rows. So you could do border top or border bottom. If you don't necessarily want, really verbose borders, you don't necessarily want or need, borders between every row. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But you might at least have a border here after your heading, and then some more table data, like that. But that kind of helps your heading stand out as a heading row or as a heading column. If it's, here, maybe you don't need these if you have a, column that's your heading. So anyway, just an option where you don't necessarily have to have, borders on every cell, but you could just do border top or border bottom on your, like this would be border bottom after your heading row that would kind of create that heading there. Yeah, it just depends on what the contents of your table is like, and what kind of borders make sense. You also want to use text align to align the text of some cells to the left and some cells to the right, kind of depending. So usually text, we like to say, align it right or maybe centered. But usually numbers you want to align them, text you might want to align left, but text you usually want to align right, especially if it's, like dollar values or something along those lines. When it's aligned right, it's a little bit easier to see like the different decimal places, in the number. So like it's a lot easier to distinguish 100 from 1,000 if it's all the numbers are aligned right, because it's very clear, okay, this number has an extra decimal point. Makes your table a little bit easier to use. Another thing that's good to do is to use background color to change the background color of alternating rows. I can talk about this a little bit later. There's, I kind of hinted at there's CSS properties you can use to target like every other element. That can be useful here. Mostly just so it's a little bit easier to track. You guys have all had to read data from a table before, and you have to like take your finger and kind of draw a line across, right, and say, okay, like here's the row I'm looking for, and here's the value, and that's kind of annoying and hard to do. So if you alternate the background color, like maybe alternate between white and a light gray or something, just to kind of create those lines for the user, so it's a little easier to track each row. Similarly, you can use hover to highlight a table row when the user is hovering over. That's something I like to do. So you can say, target like TR and on hover, maybe change the background color there to a little bit different, or change the font color or something like that, so that when the user is hovering over a certain row, it just highlights that whole row so they can clearly see the rest of the data that they're looking at. So that can be useful. So again, these are just kind of some basic tips. So these are kind of more, principles to follow. So give cells padding to help improve readability. Really important that we add some padding. Want to distinguish headings like we talked about. Shade alternate rows. Do some sort of subtle change. Also align numerals to the right so that large numbers are clearly distinguishable from smaller ones. Those are kind of some good starting places to make your tables more usable. Here's an example of a good-looking table. So, like, again, by default, this would all just be crammed together. There'd be no distinguishing the rows. But here's a good example. They haven't necessarily created a border around each cell, but they've used a bottom border here to, as a way of distinguishing the header from the content. They've also made their headers bold and all caps, just to kind of help them stand out. They've aligned numerals to the right, so like it's clearer that this is confusing because they don't have a comma here, but it's clearer, if there was a number that was a lot larger, it would be really easy to tell if that number was larger. What have they done? They've added a little bit of padding. They've added like a set width to things, so each column is the same width. That can be a useful thing to do. The content isn't crammed up. It's got some padding around each cell. Those are all great things to do. Any questions so far about styling tables? Yeah.
So for the text transform, it's to convert the content of the table to be like as an example, headers to uppercase, or is it only upper headers?
Text transform, you can do, it would just be uppercase is the option.
And then is it only upper headers? Or?
It depends. Okay. You could do other contents uppercase if you wanted to. Okay, a couple of other things are related to tables. So there's an empty cells property that can be used to specify whether or not borders for empty cells should be shown. So there's three values. Show will show the borders of empty cells. Hide will hide the borders of empty cells. Or inherit will be used if you have like nested tables. It'll take the parent's value. I don't really use inherit often here, but so as an example, target your table and say empty cells high. That can be useful for some types of tables where you may have cells that are just empty. They don't have any content in them. And sometimes you don't want your border to show. It'll kind of treat it as an empty cell and not just kind of fill it in. So like, for instance, like here, this isn't as relevant here because they don't have, borders around necessarily their empty cells, but like here's an empty cell. So if you had a border around every cell, you could say, okay, this one I don't want a border around it. I think I have an example here. Yeah, so without empty cells, say you have an empty one, an empty cell here, it would still have its border if you've added a border on all cells. Whereas here's an example where you might not want, the border to appear on an empty cell, so you'd use the empty cells property to remove that. So again, it just kind of depends on your table. There's some instances where you want to use it. There are some instances where you don't want to use it. It just kind of depends. But it's available to you as a tool. Another one is border spacing, which will allow you to control the distance between adjacent cells. So it's very similar to margin. If you try and add margin to your table cells, you'll have some issues. You're supposed to use border spacing instead, but it works very similarly to margin. So here's an example. You would say, like, target your table and say border spacing 10 pixels or something. It'll add 10 pixels of spacing between the borders of your cells. You can also specify two values if you want to separate values for horizontal and vertical spacing. So you could do, this will be your horizontal spacing, so 5 pixels to the left and right, and 15 pixels on the top and bottom. So you can do that to kind of specify. You can also use border collapse, which will collapse the borders of table cells that are adjacent to and have no space between them. So again, this gives you a little more control versus margin. Margin will always collapse top and bottom margins. It will never collapse left and right margins. So, you can add some border spacing, but then you could say, collapse as the value, which will collapse borders into a single border. Both border spacing and empty cells properties will be ignored. So again, you could run into this where, your cells technically will double up the borders if you've got a border around every cell. So you could use border collapse to say don't make two borders between two cells, just collapse it into one. Or separate, the borders will be detached from each other. Border spacing and empty cells will work. So again, these are all just kind of tools that you have available to adjust the way that your tables work. You don't have to use these properties, but if you're going for a specific look, they can be very helpful. So here's an example. First here for border spacing. So if we do like 5 pixel horizontal and 15 pixel vertical, we can separate our table cells, 5 pixels here and 15 pixels there. That can be really useful. If we had no border spacing, but if border collapse was separate, these would collapse in, but there would still be two borders here. They just wouldn't be spaced apart. So by doing border collapse, it collapses those two borders into just one border, which often is what we want. Okay, any other questions about styling tables? Okay, let's talk about forms a little bit. So forms are probably the worst as far as browsers displaying them differently by default. There can be some pretty big differences in the way that browsers display forms. So it's really useful to add some styling to kind of make them easier to use. As you probably run into with your forms so far, by default the form elements are all inline. It just kind of runs from one line to the next. You kind of have to set some things to display block or add some break tags in there to kind of break things out a little bit. We really need to add some styling to make them better. So some really commonly styled form inputs or form elements, we want to deal with our text inputs and our text series a little bit. Our submit buttons, usually we don't just stick with the default. You also kind of have to deal with the labels, including the alignment. The default way that labels work isn't very pretty. Some elements are really difficult to style, so like select boxes where you have like a drop down. You can style select boxes. It gets really hairy, and it's also different in different browsers. So I had to do that once. I got a Photoshop design of a website, and I had to go make it. And it included some forms, and the forms had drop downs, and they were like colored with borders, and like I think a background image even on the drop down, where you have the drop down, you have the selections, and they had like this weird textured background on the drop down. And it was really, really difficult to do. You have to kind of do some hacky things to style select boxes. So in general, if you can avoid it, do so. You can change like the sizes of things a little bit, but I wouldn't worry too much about styling select boxes. Same for radio buttons and checkboxes. There's some things you can do, but generally you just kind of are at the whim of what the browser does, because there's a lot of styles built in there. Really, they're round. There's gradients when you've selected them. It can be really difficult to adjust those styles. So just FYI, if you want to style those, be prepared to really have to dig into some advanced CSS stuff to achieve what you're going for. But text inputs are pretty easy to style. So again, we've already learned most of the CSS properties that you would use to style your text input. There's not anything too special that we'll use. So again, we could use font size to change the size of the text that the user enters. So by default, it's pretty small. Maybe you want to make it a little bit larger. So you can use font size on the input to change the size of the text the user enters. We use the color or the background color to set the background. Again, just like we would normal text, but you can do that on your input, and it'll affect the text that the user's typing in. A good thing to do is to add border or to control the border around the input. There's obviously some default border around inputs. I've seen some websites that remove that default border, and instead, like I was doing my taxes lately in TurboTax, and there are certain inputs where they just have a line, and you can click on the line and then type stuff. And it's an input, it's just a normal input, but they've removed all the border except the bottom border. So you just see a line, and then you can type on that line. Kind of a neat interface. So, it's just kind of up to you how you want to do that, but you may want to change the border style of the inputs to match your design. If you've got a design that has a lot of color, like you use red a lot in your design, maybe you want to make the border of your inputs red to kind of match the design of your page. You can also use border radius to create rounded corners. It's good if you have a website where, I run into this a lot with if you've got a certain button style where maybe you've got buttons that have rounded corners, you may want your inputs to also match. If you've got a lot of rounded corners on your site, you might want your inputs to match, and so you can use border radius to do that, to create an input that would look like that. You can also do things, you can use focus, the pseudo class, to change the background color of text when the input is being used. I really like doing that. One thing I'll do is I usually will go through and make all inputs slightly darker, and then when the user is focused on them, make it lighter, just so it's a little bit more clear which input the user is currently focused on. That makes the form a lot easier to use. They can see which one they've selected and they're typing in. You can also use active to apply styles when the user hovers over an input. You can also use background image to add an icon or like a texture image to the background of the input. So I've seen this a lot where you use this to kind of add a label icon. So in this case, like an email. So you've applied a background image that has that little email icon. And that way, you usually still want some sort of text label, especially for screen readers, because screen readers can't see that icon. But for most users, it's really easy to say, okay, cool, this is where I type my email, because there's a little email icon. So that can be useful. Submit buttons we can also style. So by default, they look pretty plain and boring, but we can change it up with our CSS. Again, all using styles we've already learned. Believe it or not, you've already learned most of CSS as far as styling text and styling boxes goes. So it's just kind of combining those styles we've already learned to make an interesting design. So you can use color to change the color of the text on the button. I like to use text shadow to give the text on our button kind of a 3D look to help it stand out as something you can click on. You could use like border bottom to yeah, thanks. To make the bottom border of the button look a little bit thicker. It's kind of hard to tell here, but if you make the bottom border slightly thicker, it gives a little bit of a 3D feel, so it makes your button look like something you can click on. You can use background color to set the background color of the button. We haven't talked about gradients. I don't know that we will in the scope of this class too, but adding a gradient is also a good way to achieve a 3D look. So like this button here is a little bit lighter at the top than it is at the bottom. That kind of makes it look more like a button. You can also do hover to change the appearance of the button when the user hovers over it. So, sometimes you want to make it look like it's depressed, when you hover over it and you're clicking on the button or something like that. So, again, ways that we can make our buttons fit the design of our site a little bit. Thankfully, the design trends are trending towards a more simple, flat design. The web design trends right now are kind of abandoning the 3D look. Which is good for us because it makes it easier. We have less styles to worry about. We don't have to worry about creating all these 3D effects. Most of the times with buttons now, I'll, add some padding to them so they're a little bigger, add a solid background color, choose a good foreground color that makes sense, maybe add some sort of interaction when you hover over it, change the color slightly, something like that to make sure the user can tell they can click on it. It may be a really simple 3D effect. Sometimes I like to add some box shadow to the buttons to make them look a little bit popped out, but still pretty simple. I don't usually worry about making the button itself look raised or anything, which is nice that we can be stylistic and not be super complicated in our style. So anyway, those are kind of the kinds of things that I like to do on buttons. Field sets and legends are really useful, especially useful, in our HTML to kind of break out certain sections of our form and to kind of organize things a little bit better. But field sets, interestingly, the browsers are a little bit more opinionated. They draw a border around them. They put the legend up in the upper left. So we can, use some styling to make it a little bit better. So again, adding width to control the width of the field set is really useful. So, by default, things are just going to take up the full width of the page. Often in our forms, we don't want it to be super wide. We want to kind of keep things, a little bit tighter and usable. So we could just use some width. You can use color and background color to make your field set stand out a little bit, or make the label stand out. Again, by default, there's a border around the field set, so we can just use the border property to customize that, or you can do border none if you don't want that border. You can also use border radius to soften the edges of these elements with a rounded border. I think by default, field sets do have a rounded border, so maybe you want to remove that if your design doesn't, involve rounded borders. That would be fine. Also, really common to add some padding around your field set, which will kind of space your form out a little bit more. Again, by default, it's pretty tight, and it doesn't look as good. So adding a little bit of padding will help a lot. In general, we'll talk about this more when we talk about kind of general design principles. Adding white space, adding padding around stuff, spacing things out will almost always make your design look better than if everything's all crunched together and really tight. Just by adding some spacing, you can make your website look much, much better just by spacing things out. Okay, aligning form controls is important. So again, when you're thinking about your form, you want to think about, how the user is going to read through your form, where your labels are positioned to make it clear what label goes with what input. There's nothing worse than a form where it's kind of difficult to tell what you're supposed to put in a certain box, right? I've encountered this a bunch where The labels aren't really clearly positioned to indicate what should go in a certain box. You type what you think is supposed to go in there. Turns out you were wrong. You get an error. You have to redo things. It's a huge pain in the butt. So making sure your form labels match up with your inputs is really useful. So one thing I like to do is wrap each form input and its label in a div tag, which will help by putting each input on its own line. So that's a good way to, one, kind of combine the label and the input, especially if you're using the for and the ID, to group them. But divs are block elements. So if our label and our input are inside of a div, then each label and input together will get its own line. And that kind of solves the biggest issue with forms, which is just that it's all inline and it's just all going to kind of wrap in a line. So yeah, if the labels are just kind of all inline, it looks kind of messy. One thing we can do too is use float. We haven't talked about float much yet, but you can move the labels to the left of the page and make sure all your labels are on the left. I like to do that versus having the labels right above the input sometimes, because sometimes if you've got label, input, label, input, label, input, once you get, you scroll down to your page and you just see this, sometimes it's a little hard to tell if the label goes here or goes here. Again, usually it's obvious, but, if you can't see the first one, you can't see the last one, sometimes it can start to get a little confusing. Whereas if you do, label, input, label, input, it's usually a lot clearer what goes with what. So that's typically what I like to do. So you could use float left on your inputs or on your labels to make them go to the left. Also like to set width on the labels to have them all take up the same space, which will align your form a little bit better. So rather than so rather than having label and then your input, and then you've got a label and an input, and then a label and an input where they're not aligned. By setting just a set width to your your labels, you can kind of add some more consistency. So you could have label, so this is a label tag, but if it's got a certain width on it, it'll take up this amount of space, and then your input, and then all of your labels will take up this width no matter what their content is. So it can be a longer label, it can be a shorter label, but it'll all be aligned to what your input is. So that can be useful. And actually, if you do this, I actually like to do text align right on the labels. If you have this, when you get down here, you're putting something here, you go, oh wait, what am I supposed to type here? And you have to look all the way over here to find out what the label is. So if you are doing this, I like to use text align right to say, input, or label, so that the label is still close to the input, but they're still aligned, if that makes sense. So that's usually what I like to do. So yeah, here, text align can be used to align the titles or your labels to the right. Typically what I like to do. You can also use padding to create some gap between your label and your form control. So again, you don't want, label, input, you want, label, and then maybe a little bit of space in input. Not a ton, but a little bit, just to kind of give things a little bit of room to breathe. Okay, any questions about form controls? Again, there's no hard and fast rules. These are kind of suggestions. These are tools that we have available to use. You really kind of have to think for yourself, what's the purpose of my form? What makes it easiest for the user? If you're building TurboTax, it's a little different than if you just have a feedback form, or if you're building Facebook and users can add a post. It's a little bit different than TurboTax, where it's really specific. You've got a really complex interface. You want it to be clear. what goes with what. I think TurboTax would even do stuff like they would have, like because TurboTax has a lot of inputs, so they would have, like they'd have all their inputs aligned, and I think they would have like their, labels. It's like the fire alarm or something. Oh, okay. They'd have like their label, and then they have like dot 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 dot, just to kind of make it clear, what label with what input, because again, it's all relative to your design. TurboTax has to fit a lot of inputs into a relatively small space because they've got a lot of information you have to put in. It's a complicated form. They've got like 20 inputs on one page. So they've got them pretty tight, but they use everything they can to make it clear what input goes with what label, so you don't make a mistake. Because if you make a mistake in TurboTax, it's a pretty big deal, right? You might get a call from the IRS because you messed up the order of your inputs. That's a big deal, so they care a lot about it being really clear what goes with what. So again, just thinking about how you align your form is really important. So here's an example. Again, before, if you just have kind of a messy default, this at least has, a new line for each one, but it's not a real great form. It doesn't look good either, So, here's after. So we've done some things. Got a little tooltip there, but we've added some border bottom to the div. So each, input has a border between it to kind of separate them a little bit. We've added some margin to each div. We've added padding bottom to the div so that they're spaced out a little bit. We've set width on our div so that our form, takes up a certain width. We've taken our title or our inputs and we've floated them left. We've given them a set width so that it's the same each time. We've text aligned right. So it's like, gender here, it's a little bit longer, but it's still the same distance from the input as these are. That's because it's text aligned right, so that this space is always consistent. Our submit button, we've text aligned it right rather than the default of just being over here to the left. That's kind of debatable. Just kind of depends on what you want to do, what you think looks best and is easiest to use. Usually, I actually like to text align the submit button to the left because usually your eye is reading here, here, here. Then now it's on okay, is my form over? And you have to go all the way and say, okay, here's the submit button. Whereas if it's here on the left, it's a little bit easier to say, okay, I'm done, I'm ready to submit. Again, subtle differences, but it can't make a difference. This would look better, I would say, but it's more usable, I would argue, to have it aligned left. Again, kind of up to you. But it's pretty clear that this form looks better than this form. Just by adding some simple styles that we've already learned, and it already looks way more professional and way more easier to read and easier to use. And more trustworthy, too. Like something we'll talk about when we talk about design principles is, just this, these short styles make our form, if this is like your credit card information and, your address, because it's an order form, and the form looks like this, and like, this seems sketchy. Like, I don't know if I trust this. But if it looks like this, it's like, okay, sure, like, this is a good website. All it is 5 or 6 rules of CSS, but it feels better. And that's important when we want our users to feel like this is a real website, it's professional, we're not gonna steal their identity. If TurboTax looked shoddy, I wouldn't use it. I'd be like, no, I don't trust this. But they've obviously put in time and effort into the style of their site, so it feels trustworthy just by being a little bit more professional looking, a little bit more neat. Okay, a couple of other examples. There's just a link here. If that HTML and CSS book that I recommend, if you wanted a textbook to go along with the class, they have some code samples. I can show you some of these in this link. I think I have a couple of examples of my own as well. So again, these are just some different HTML examples. I'll just kind of show you the main ones. So like list style image, here's an example where you'd have an image as a list style. So again, if you inspect to look at their CSS, and we look at, it's probably on the UL, so they have list style image and then URL. So that's how they achieve that, and that's what that looks like. It just uses that image in place of the list style. The list style position we'll look at. So, again, here's the difference between list style position outside, which is these at the top. So again, you can even, kind of see here. So here's the LI. It inherits from the UL, the list style position. So they've, on the UL, they've said list style position is outside. And then you can even see, like when we highlight it here, we can see the box for the LI is here, and it doesn't include because the bullet is positioned outside of our content box. Whereas these down here, where the value is list style position inside, we've got our LI content boxes, and the bullet is positioned inside the content box of the contents of the element. So again, subtle differences, but it does make a difference, and there are different uses for each, kind of depending on what your content is like. Some table properties, and let's look at a gap between cells. So yeah, this is just an example of that table I showed earlier. They've got a nice effect on hover, where it kind of highlights that row. That's really nice. So if we look at that, again, this is where inspect is awesome, because if you find a website that has a cool table that has some cool effect, open up the inspector and look at how they did it. You can see how any website is built this way. So they've got TR. You notice they use each. They kind of did it the easy way as opposed to using a fancy CSS selector. But they've got even and odd rows colored slightly differently. So the way they did that is just by adding an even class to the rows that are even. That's a really simple way to do it. If you've got like a application where that content can change, that gets a little bit trickier. But it's really simple. They've just added class equals even on the even rows. That way they can style those rows a little bit differently. So right here's their rule, tr.even, and they've set the background color to a little bit different, a little bit of a darker gray. Really, really useful. Then they also have probably on the TRs, maybe it's on, trying to see. Sometimes with like stuff like hover, you have to actually look at the source. You can't see an inspector. But here they have TR, and then they use that hover pseudo class, and they change the background there on hover. So just when you hover over TR, the background color changes. That provides some really nice functionality. Some other things they did, so like on their headings, they use text transform uppercase. They added a little bit of letter spacing just to space things out a bit. Again, that's a pretty subtle difference, but it can make a big difference. So like, here's this, and we can, just uncheck this to see the difference. So like here, that looks okay too. That doesn't look bad. But once you add that spacing, it breaks those things down to a new line as well. But adding that spacing just helps differentiate the heading from the content a little bit. And you would never, when it's like this, there's a chance that you would think author is an author, or it's not quite as 100% clear that this is a heading. But by adding that letter spacing, you're just making it a little bit more obvious. Because like if we took out all of these and there was no differences, there's no border, I guess the alignment was the same, it's still pretty clear it's a heading, but, it's not super, super obvious that it's different from the rest of your content. So again, that's what those can be used for. Let me pull it up. Yeah, gaps between. So yeah, here's just an example of the gaps between your borders. So say we take this first one, if we remove the border spacing, there's still some extra padding in here coming from somewhere. Yeah, this TD padding, this would be margin. But you know, if you remove all the spacing between your cells, those borders are going to be doubled up and just be condensed. Whereas this second table, they've added border collapse just to collapse those down into single borders. So that's kind of useful. Let's see what else. Styling text inputs and submit buttons. So again, here's some examples of styling our text inputs. So they've used background image to set the to put those icons in there. You know, this is a bad example because they still should have some sort of text, or at least if you're going to do this, there are at least ways within your HTML to maybe you could have. Here's a good example of using like visibility. You might want to have, label for equals email, and then, email, close your label. But say you just don't want that text there, one thing that you could do is say, display none. So it's going to remove that label from your page, but it's still in your HTML. So when a screen reader, and there are actually some rules around this, I think generally display none, or sometimes you have to add an extra class that says for screen readers don't do display none. But a screen reader typically will still read elements like this. They'll say, okay, label, email, here's your input. So the screen reader still gets the benefit of the label even though it's not visible on your page. So again, you don't want to just rely on icons. But that said, it does look cool. So they've used background image, and they've given it a URL to this icon, and that adds that little icon in there. It's pretty nice. You'll notice they've also added some padding. So they've got here, a little bit of padding on the top right and on the bottom of the input. So that's just padding here between where the user's typing. So there's a little bit of space above the text, a little bit of space below. So without that padding, it would look, like that. It's just a lot more cramped. And notice they added 30 pixels of left padding to account for that icon. So that background image doesn't take up space by default. It's just in the background. So they've had to add padding to the left, 30 pixels to push the text over so the text doesn't go over the icon there. So that's an important thing to note. They've also, used a few, I don't think we've talked about these, background repeat and background position to kind of position that. So like, without those two, the default using the background image, it repeats and it's not positioned properly. So by background repeat, no repeat, it just shows the background image once. And then obviously the background image is just in the very top left. That's not quite what we want. So we've used background position to move it a little bit into position. So again, we'll talk more about those properties a little bit later. And then notice, they change the styles when you hover, so it's pretty clear which input you're hovering over. So they've, removed the background color, they've changed the border color, has a nice effect. Once you've clicked into it, it remains in that style, so it's clear. This is super helpful. Again, something like TurboTax. I'm going to keep going back to this because I was doing my taxes last weekend. And I was just like amazed because TurboTax is awesome, but it's some crazy complicated web development. It's really important in TurboTax that you can see which form input you've selected and you're typing into, because again, you don't want to type the wrong thing into the wrong place. So really important. Any questions so far? think that's about it. Let's see what this example is. I think this is an example form. Yeah, or a couple of example, just some examples, I guess. So one, they've got a list using, list image. They've got a really nicely styled form here. Again, using only the properties we've learned so far in class. They've added some text shadow to make this 3D look. They've got borders. They've got a background color. They've aligned the text. It looks really nice. It's really clear what the headings are. They're really differentiated from the rest of the text. And then here's a nice form. So they've got all their inputs are aligned. They've got set widths to their labels. I'd prefer if they did text align right here, but it's okay. They've got some spacing between the input elements, especially different kind of groups here. They've got name and email, and then a little bit of space between the next one, just because those are kind of related. They've got their input button styled. It's not just the default boring input button. So yeah, it's really nice. So if you want to, when you look at the slides, pull up this page and kind of inspect around and kind of see how they accomplish those styles. So again, they've got a field set here. They changed the background color of the field set from the background color of the page to kind of make it stand out a little bit. So it looks a little bit nicer. Good example. Okay, that pretty much covers it for today. Don't forget your quizzes on Thursday. Let me run through real fast the study guide just to see if there's anything I want to point out to help you out a little bit. And then on Thursday, we'll also cover your next assignment, because the current assignment is due on Thursday, but I'll go ahead and introduce the next one. The next assignment is really just adding more styles to that city guide that we already have. So it'll be just adding on top of the styles you've already done. So we'll add some of these styling your form on your page, styling your table on your page, things like that. Look for quizzes. Quiz 3 study guide. Oops. Wrong account. Continue. So I don't know what to do at all. I don't know if that's correct. I don't know why it doesn't want me to open this. Switch accounts. Choose an account. Add account. Continue. That's weird. Sign out. So I don't know. Did I? Maybe I have this downloaded. Yeah, quiz 3 study guide. Okay, so going back to our first lecture on CSS, it's chapter 10 and 11 in the HTML and CSS book if you want to read along there. So what does CSS stand for? What does it do? How to include CSS on a page? So there's kind of a bad, better, and best option. So make sure you know those. The anatomy of the CSS rules, so like the selector versus the declaration. And then the declarations part that has a property and a value. Make sure you know those. Different types of CSS selectors, so like the type selector, class selector, ID selector, so on and so forth. How cascading works. So, if you have the same selector in multiple places, how it determines which one is applied. So like the order obviously is part of it, whatever comes last, but then also the specificity. Make sure you're aware of those. How to do a comment in CSS, so it's different than HTML, so make sure you're aware of that. Color properties and value formats. So just the different ways to specify color. Be roughly familiar with those. Selling text, so types of typefaces, so make sure you know the difference between serif, sans serif, and monospace. How to specify fonts, so like how to use font family. How to change the size of the fonts. Roughly how to include fonts from a file. If you have to include an outside file. Which I keep in mind. Thanks. Text weight, styles, decorations, and transforms. So again, just be roughly familiar with these. Line, letter, and word spacing, text alignment, indentation, shadows, pseudo elements and pseudo classes that we talked about. So again, there's a lot there, but just be familiar with all of those. And then CSS box model too. So like box dimensions, how to handle when the content is longer than the dimensions of the box. So how to handle overflow. What the difference is between margin and padding. How to specify border. How to change versus inline and block. How to hide boxes on the page if you want to hide certain elements. Roughly, some information about box shadow, what that's used for, as well as how you would do rounded corners on a box. So, any questions about the quiz? It's roughly the same as the other quizzes, the same length, the same types of questions, kind of fill in the blank. I try to not. There might be one or two like write a CSS rule to do this, but I try to not have it be too much of verbose, coding by hand. There might be one or two, but not a ton. Okay. Well, that's all I've got. If you need help with your assignment, I'll stick around for a little bit, and then I'll see you on Thursday. What's that?
It sounds like you're around helping. It's like these files, they don't exist anymore. And then also like it doesn't have that setting